Hi, my name is Bill Blank, and I'm here to talk about pattern of life. Thanks, Dave, for inviting me onto the panel. Dave asked me to sort of give a general overview, so I'm not going to do much of a marketing pitch, and I'm just going to go right at it. So, let's see here. That's the
Point down there.
Other. So again, my name is Bill Blank, and I'm a programmer with DI Guy, then product manager, then sales manager. DI Guy is software for human simulation. I think of it as two pieces. One part being visual solutions. So if you just want to put a character in the world, you can buy a DI Guy and get that soldier or pedestrian running around the world. And also the AI side and what we call life form servers, that is systems that send pattern of life out into distributed simulation exercises. Okay. What do I think of as pattern of life? I find it maybe slightly different than Dave. I think of it in particular as the ambient behavior of civilian populaces. So I differentiate pattern of life a bit from, say, how oppositional forces are moving or how to move in formation, those sorts of things. What is pattern of life simulation important for? One's for analytics. Maybe you want to create an environment where you believe you have a good model of pattern of life and then adjust parameters and see what happens. The second is more the one that we typically do, where it serves as a backdrop. We've been funded by JIDO and the Air Force and the Marines to do big simulations where you're trying to defeat the IEDs, and the pattern of life is an important backdrop. The people who are planning these sorts of devices aren't stupid, they're hard to find. A lot of the work is sort of detective work, and so having that pattern of life is important. And then the third is frankly just any sort of training where civilians are important assets on the battlefield. I made a gigantic list of items in here, so I'm just going to dig through them really quick and talk about what I think is important. And notice I highlighted performance on here, and performance is something that just recurs again and again, I'm sure, for all of us, that because pattern of life, we're always talking about lots of people, simulating lots of people, lots of entities is always a challenge. So the way we do it is we start with what I would say an individual agent-based method. That is, every person in that pattern of life is a thinking agent. But there is the other side of the world. You can do it with aggregate as well. And the truth is probably you want to have a balance of the two. So again, the agents I think are great because you can perturb them and they're going to react. And as these different ones interact with each other, you're going to get, what I would loosely call emergent behavior. It's really not the technical definition of it. But I think that's really exciting. Problem is it doesn't always scale that well, again, because everyone's thinking. The more and more you make, the more and more expensive it is. Aggregate on the other side scales really, really well, but sometimes I think that's a bit of you've already solved the problem. So, I think the trick for a lot of this work is to use level of detail so that the people on the far side of the city are being modeled with aggregate, and the people up close that you're interested in or perturbing in some way are being modeled in an agent-based style. An area that's important for pattern of life also is what I would call visual individuality. If you have a terrain that's filled with a lot of people that all look exactly the same, all move exactly the same, it doesn't feel like pattern of life. Another important thing which Dave touched on is scheduling. Everyone pretty much in these societies, we all live in functions on schedules. And so you want to have a way to really easily put schedules in and out for the characters in your scene and develop them that way. You typically want to talk about percentages, subsets of the population, and give them sort of a window to operate in that schedule. An important one that I'm really interested in tackling in the upcoming years is what I call the vehicular pedestrian continuum. Pattern of life, if you really think about it, we're all getting in and out of cars, and we're all getting on buses, and we're getting on trains, and I'm flying from Boston to come here to the conference. And particularly, if you're, say, a UAV and you're flying over, you're actually not seeing a lot of pedestrian activity. You're really seeing the vehicular activity. So I think that we see out there in the industry today some really nice vehicular models, and we see some really nice pedestrian models. But maybe the two interacting is an area I think that could be worked on by a lot of people. There we go. Affordable authoring is a really important part of pattern of life that can't be emphasized enough. Because you're trying to simulate all these people and do all these things, if you don't make it affordable to do pattern of life, it's just not going to happen. And so a lot of activities come around addressing this affordability. So one thing like we do, for example, is smart buildings, where when we place a building in an environment like a farm, the farm will come with a farm family, and the family will have a schedule, and they'll go about doing their farming in the day. Here's an example, and I know this is quick to look at this, but we had a nice job with the Marines where we used smart buildings to also model an IED network. So we'd actually, have the bomb maker's house and have the financier's house, and we would bury that within a much larger pattern of life. And that was a way to make some of that authoring affordable and tractable for people doing the authoring. Another way to make things important or make things easy and effective is to use what I call smart objects, which is simply to make sure that you have entities that you can interact with. Sometimes that is in fact buildings where the building will help direct you, say, to where the front door is. And so here's an example of a mosque where our characters will say, I really want to go pray. The mosque will tell them where it is. The mosque will also then divide them by sects to each half of the mosque. And that's something that the mosque understands, but the people don't. And that's actually really good because it keeps the people sort of lightweight in terms of how much AI they have. An important area of pattern of life, but I think a particularly difficult one, easy to say, hard to do, is the PMESII work. So you want to be able to affect these atmospherics, have the society change and all that. But again, in my experience so far is that this is easy to talk about, very difficult to do. It's very difficult, in fact, to model pattern of life where you think you know exactly the way you want to have people behave. So to be able to have them affected by various things, well, if you look at the Arab Spring or something, even people who aren't trying to build that stuff in don't necessarily know what's going to happen when things change. An important subtle point is operator accessibility. Typically, your pattern of life is going to be run inside a training environment, and those trainers darn well know how they want to train their students. So if you don't make it accessible for them that they can make changes on the fly, it's not going to be a particularly useful pattern of life that you've developed. My last point that I'll touch on is standalone versus distributed. There are use cases certainly for standalone applications, and I mentioned analytics in the beginning. But again, what we've really focused on is more the distributed simulation. We have many people participating in the exercise. Typically for us, it's using a DIS or an HLA protocol and having the pattern of life put out there so that everybody can see it and that all the entities and people, live training people that are working on that simulation can all affect that pattern of life and exist within that pattern of life. Well, right now, that's really the sweet spot for us, and so I'm really excited about that. So that is my incredibly compressed 10 years of thinking about some of this stuff into 5 minutes. If you have some questions at the end, I think that's the time we should take them, not now. But thank you again for taking your time to listen to me. I appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Paul. That was a great introduction. Our next speaker is Colin from Discovery Machine.
Okay, hello, I'm Colin Puskowitz from Discovery Machine. I'm going to talk a little bit about our behavior altering approaches for pattern of life. So first off, just to give a brief overview of the approach that Discovery Machine feels is the direction of pattern of life. We use a template-based model, which allows you to set up certain core functionality for a role in a village. So think of a street vendor who acts a certain way and a villager who acts a certain other way. And they are able to go to certain locations throughout their daily life, the same as you and I would. So to work at their working times, to go home to go to bed at certain other times. By doing things in this approach, we're able to create these intelligent models. There's a few aspects about models that make them easier to drive. So one thing, we work with very closely with subject matter experts, and the experts allow us to create very realistic representations of these particular characters. We also want to make things understandable to those end users. So it touches on some of the points that previous presenters have made, which is we want to make information accessible to the end user and easily adaptable. Another aspect which is very important is the ability to respond to changes in that scenario. If you have a character who does the same thing every time you do it, doesn't make it very realistic, doesn't make it very much like a normal pattern of life. And so behaviors need to be able to respond. I'm going to quickly go over this slide here, but this slide is talking about how by directing those patterns with particular goals, we can actually direct where they're going. So think of the situation as have one section of behavior processing the world around a particular character. And as that particular person sees new things and learns new information, he can actually adapt and find his way around a map or a scenario in a realistic manner that is not entirely scripted, but dynamic based on the situation itself. So there are a few aspects that we can monitor at runtime, which are also pretty essential for the simulated training environment. You have the ability to view each character model in the top, on the top left corner of your screen there, you're seeing a list. Each one would control a different character in a simulation. You can also open up any one of those and see visually what that character would appear. As it's executing its pattern of life, you can see what it's doing at any given time. So that allows instructors to see the execution of these models. You can also interact with any character via dialogue, selection windows, voice, etc., other technologies. And any sort of interaction can be built into it. So just real quick on ways that we can do this type of authoring. So to touch back on the template model that we were talking about previously, this is highlighting a street vendor. So a street vendor in an Afghani village, in this case, has certain things that he does. He goes to work, he interacts with customers, he interacts with various other things. Then we can define those certain inputs for that character to make him customized for the situation. And so things like where he works, where he sleeps, what time he works, and his mood towards certain things all affect his pattern of life without actually specifying any new script behind the scenes. It's all done with user interfaces, easy to follow, easy to use. To touch back on one of the points that Dave had made on the annotated urban environment, this screen is a representation of one of those such terrains where we've auto-populated a series of locations. So if you see all the blue dots on the screen there, they're all locations that were lifted out of that AUE type file. Now in this case we're showing VBS2, and you could very easily extrapolate a similar type thing in other simulations. So blue dots are locations for homes and workplaces, and the green dots are actually people in this case. And you can intelligently place them at locations as well. This just kind of re-emphasizes that. So the point in the upper right where the arrow is pointing is one location, and it's specified in a behavior input screen as appears in the lower left of your screen. In a similar way, we can affect the change of the various scenario with the use of a social network. So you and I all have various kinds of associations in our lives. We have friends, family members, business associates. and many others. Those are just to name a few. And we interact with those people differently. So perhaps you get frightened in a certain situation. You're going to call your best friend or your family members and tell them about what's going on in your life. They, as a result, will alter their behavior in accordance with you. So if you offend certain people in a village, the village should respond accordingly and be less forthcoming with information with you. If you make people happy, maybe that same village will be more equipped to give you that information. And that's much more reflective of a typical society. And then just real quickly, in order to interact with people realistically, you have to have certain conversations with them. So by creating interactions, you can actually augment those moods as well. Similar to the previous statement about passing information, if you say certain things to people, they can tell other people, and other characters in the same scene can learn those various details and adjust how they behave in that fashion. The concept of events are simple changes in a scenario which you can trigger based on certain criteria. So events, as an example, to touch back on if you offend one person, maybe certain key aspects in a training scenario are either harder to complete or impossible to complete. Maybe people go home, maybe you trigger explosions in a background which would force people to run away if you don't follow the right course of action or you proceed incorrectly in situations. On the flip side of that, players need to accomplish certain goals, and an objective is one way of driving that. Just to touch on the aspect of understandability of these types of behaviors, all behaviors should be visually represented, and our language does represent them as such. So this snapshot, just to show a quick picture of a pattern of life type activity. There's some street vendors kind of standing on the side interacting with customers. All of this is being driven without any conventional scripting. They're going to locations where they know street vendors are. The villager is selecting who they should approach, lingering there, interacting there, and then going to the next location. If something were to change in the scenario, they can respond, and maybe they don't go shopping anymore if it's dangerous. Maybe they just run home. So some benefits to this type of an approach. To instructors, you can actually very rapidly create these types of behaviors without having to go in and change the scripting. If something changes, you can go back and change it very quickly. If instructors typically rely on technical staff, they don't have to as much because they're equipped with tools that are more in line with what they're used to. On the active duty side of things, there's a more rapid turnaround of things without having to go back and specify all of those script files with locations and things of that nature. If something changes, which happens on a daily basis, things change in society, how you respond changes, you can go back and add those types of adjustments very rapidly and train people in the newest, latest things rather than having the lag time in development. The other benefit is you can train more people. So the fact of the matter is, with budget cuts, certain training groups, they only train a small subset of the group that is going to need certain skills. You can enhance the amount of people who complete those types of training, as well as repeat the training multiple times at a fraction of the expense. So that concludes my portion here. Hand it off.
Thank you very much, Colin. So I think we see some similarities and some differences already. The last speaker of the panel was Doug Reese from BT Mott. There you go. All right. You're trained.
All right, I'm trained. All right. So what they said. All right, so yeah, actually we'll sort of reaffirm some of the things he said. I'm going to present something as maybe a little bit broader view of pattern of life. So in response to the questions, I thought about, well, what is pattern of life? And this will be sort of what it is for our tools, too. So the common usage is sort of routine activity of civilians in the society. I think that's what we've been hearing. And that's usually based on some sort of 24-hour clock, sequence of activity on a 24-hour clock, and what the activity is depends on what the entity type is, what their occupation is, whether they're a student or something. And generally, it's manifested in movement between places, and we saw the support for that in these tools. And more interestingly, these daily routines can change from day to day, for special days. And of course, we're all familiar with having our own calendars with, a special meeting on a certain day and a concert on another day, and so there can be very irregular things going on too, which gets even harder. Now, so these individual routines can be, called patterns, and then of course there's all these people doing this stuff together can form sort of an aggregate pattern as well. Now, there are other things that happen in life that are animated and happen periodically and regularly, and these are also can be considered patterns. So you could be looking at some smaller portion of your domain and seeing activity in there, and you don't really see what happens outside of it, but you see activity there. That could be a pattern as well. That could be cars. You could be looking at just people in some, passing by someplace. You could be looking at aircraft going through a sector or coming in and out of an airport. Subway trains or commuters coming in and out of a certain location. The activity, flight operations on an aircraft carrier, all the planes, the helicopters, the people running around the deck, they go through cyclical things, they go through combat operations. Or any other military operations. So if you have a military simulation and you have a friendly unit next door that's doing stuff, or you have a logistics trail or something, there may be regular activity there that's kind of background. You could be looking at animals, either regular things or periodic things, birds flying by, or just stuff wandering around the street. Maybe that's more random, but it's all animate activity. Even plants, the simulation can have trees blowing in the wind. That's animated activity as the realism of the simulation. So that's a little bit broader definition. So why is pattern of life simulation desirable in a game? Well, the first thing is just, adds realism somehow, right? And but really that's kind of adding realism the same way that improved graphics adds realism. We get better and better graphics, and then we can add more and more detail and more models to our scene, and yep, it looks more realistic. Is that necessarily required for training? Well, that's sort of an area for study, right? What do you need to make your simulation realistic? How does that impact training? And in fact, simulations always make abstractions in some ways, and often in a lot of dimensions. And you can look at a military training simulation and look at time. Well, maybe it doesn't. The maneuver training simulation doesn't simulate all the planning and rehearsal that goes up to the combat operations, and it doesn't include the security and consolidation and sustainment ops afterwards. So it's a narrow point in time. It may not include all the battlefield operating systems. It may not include all the tasks, maybe unit task trainers. So pattern of life is kind of along there. Well, you can have different levels of pattern of life, and what do you really need to accomplish your training objectives? So the thing is, though, more and more, the contemporary conflicts are in urban populated areas, not in empty deserts with just tanks in them or something. And so knowledge and use of human terrain is a primary part of what's going on. And so that's why they're more important. Civilian infrastructure provides clutter in a couple of ways. It may just get in the way of operations, or it may distract sensors or humans. Okay, now, so there's kind of a gray area here between just sort of eye candy and actually affecting what's going on, right? And then what's more, it might be the focus of training, right? The training, maybe the point is to figure out what's going on in the environment, right? Now the pattern of life is the subject of the training. Maybe the trainee is trying to find anomalies in the pattern, not just understand what's going on. Maybe the trainee is looking for specific patterns, or maybe the trainee wants to actually influence what's going on, right? So these are much more stringent requirements for pattern of life. All right, so what do you need to do to have a pattern of life in your simulation, and why is it hard? All right, well, you can have different levels of detail, based kind of what I just said about Is this just eye candy, or is it, how does it relate to the training objective? You consider, say, traffic, cars. You could have a simulation that just had static traffic densities, like looking at Google traffic or something, right? And that has some simulation of pattern of life in it. It's kind of static, maybe changes over time, but it's just aggregate numbers. You can get more detail. You can just kind of put individual cars there at some density. Then you could have them moving, maybe at least in the right direction. You can get more detail and have them in correct lanes, and you can have them moving at correct speeds. You can get even more detail and have them respond to traffic control devices, and so forth and so on. And down towards the end, you're modeling each driven vehicle as an agent that's got a purpose to go from some origin to some destination, and they're interacting with other cars and communicating and everything, right? So this whole range, and the level of detail required depends on what your training objectives are. All right, so what are the challenges? Well, we've talked about some of them. You probably implicitly are talking about a large number of entities, and not only is it a computation problem, but it's a scenario authoring problem. If you have higher levels of detail, then you need a way to author complex intelligent behavior, and that's kind of a problem by itself. Colin described a tool to develop a lot of this stuff. I'll say more about that in a moment. If the background pattern of life is the focus of the scenario, you want an easy way to create all that complexity. Very specific things going on that you need. You need a way to easily create that, not just background. Let's say, so it might not be the focus, in which case you can do general things. It might be the focus, in which case you have to do very specific training objective-driven things. There may be interactions, and I think Dave, you mentioned emergent behavior. It may be that what you want or what you're going to get if you have agent-based behavior is emergent patterns, and those are complex systems, notoriously hard to predict, notoriously hard to control or establish in a scenario. So what can we do for tools? Well, so we need some way to rapidly generate these scenarios, and so we've heard about a couple of different ways to do that. You may want to have rapid creation of a lot of similar things. You may want to have distributions of entities, different attributes, different occupations, whatever. You want to be able to do that easily and rapidly. You want to have desired mover behaviors, maybe in a limited area of interest. You want to have a means to assigning cultural meaning, so those areas. You want to have a way to provide varying patterns over time, because that's part of what we think of as patterns. All right, so where authoring scenarios is the primary focus, you have to have a mechanism and language for describing complex behavior. So Colin gave an illustration of something there. I contend that this is still a fairly open research problem. The kind of thing that Colin described, I think, is sort of, that fairly sophisticated tool, I think, is kind of like a minimum entry in order to do that. You have to be able to express all of the parameters and things that go into making that pattern of life. And it's another question about whether that's easy to do, even if you're a subject matter expert. So that's a hard thing to do. And if you're really interested in identifying subtle differences in behavior of some entities, of your target entities versus the background patterns, you can't make that too easy, right? You can't have dumb background patterns and then have someone who's obviously doing something very deliberate and focused. That's too easy. And you don't, on the other hand, want it to look all just the same. So that's a very hard thing to do. There's some research projects underway to try to address that. VTMOC has a constructive simulation that allows us to do some of this, I guess it's more appropriate for a pattern of life where it's not a specific focus of the simulation. So we have a tool that allows a user, not a programmer, to drop down abstract spawn points in the simulation. And each one of these will generate entities. And the idea is, in general, you would put this outside your area of interest. and then the entities would move through your area of interest, although you can do other variations on that. And so you get some parameters with that. You can generate random, some mix of random mix of entities, and it can be any kind of entities, so vehicles or animals or people or what have you. You can put multiple spawn points in the same place, so you can generate different distributions of entities. You can generate entities at regular intervals or with a variance between spawning. You can generate them continuously or in bursts, so that might be useful, say, for a subway arrival that happens every 5 minutes or something, you get a burst of traffic. You can have it happen continuously or at a certain time of day, and again, you can stack the spawn points, so you can have distributions of entities that are different, both densities and types over time. And you can have just one entity, so a particular type of an entity, or like a family unit could be generated at a house, and that's the only thing generated there. Or you can just have traffic entities generated continuously in some really large number. And then the behavior of these spawned entities, the default is just to have them move from a spawn point to a sync point. So the idea there is to make it very easy to author a scenario where you have entities flowing through an area of interest. You just click, basically 2 clicks, and you've got your spawn sync point, and entities start to move through. However, instead of just moving, they can run basically an arbitrary scripted behavior that a user can define with a general purpose scripting language. So, just in conclusion, background pattern of life. It's useful to distinguish between sort of background and focus pattern of life. It adds realism and clutter to a battlefield, and there are tools available for rapid generation of background pattern of life, where you have where the pattern is the focus of the behavior. Then you need tools for generating high fidelity behavior and cognitive models in effect. And the tools that have been described here are a good start toward that, but there's still a lot more behavior modeling research to make that accurate, realistic, and easy to author.
Sure. Thank you very much, Doug. So I'd like to thank Doug and Colin and Bill. I think whether you know it or not, you just sat through a A+ seminar in pattern of life. All, by the way, perfectly on time. That's Scott's main concern. So we have a few minutes for questions if you want to turn on the mics here. Address them to the panelists, if you would. Or definitely see them afterwards. Or I think BT Mock and also Discovery Machine and ourselves have booths in the trade show. So I'm sure we're all happy to talk more about what we're doing. So if there's some questions from the audience, I know we're actually not late by some time. Yes, sir.
Are your customers utilizing all of the features that you provide, or just some of them?
I think everybody has a different sort of license model or how that is. I think we wanted to keep questions maybe to more about the need for pattern of life or functionality and things like that. I'm sure each of those folks would love to tell you about their licensing.
Okay, sure. Thank you.
Offline. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
That's two, actually. On the annotated urban environment, are there terrain correlation issues that I think I understood you saying it's separate from the other terrain, so you have to correlate it separately to each type of terrain you might use a given one with?
No, actually, it's generated at the time when you're generating all the other runtimes. In fact, it's generated before those runtimes. So if you think of it as generating to an intermediate representation from which each of the runtimes that you want are spicketed off, it's derived from that. So it's just correlated as it's going to be to each of the runtimes individually. Then you may have runtime correlation across that. No, that's the point.
And then on the no twins concept, can you just expand a little bit? I've not heard that before.
Sure. Just that, if you look around this room right now, everyone has a unique appearance. Everyone's wearing a different colored shirt, different this, different that. So how do you do that in a distributed environment so that it's not too expensive for me to say that, you're wearing the red shirt and you're executing a certain type of behavior, executing a gesture where your hand's on your cheek, that kind of thing. And what I think we see pretty much in all simulations today is a certain finite number of characters out there. So we're trying to chip away at that and make it more of a continuum of appearances and behavior.
Other questions? Now's a great chance. All right, I think we've exhausted questions. Thank you all very much. Please thank the panelists.